consolidating and tailoring government advice for the consumer healthcare industry. I'm just going to check if anyone can't hear me or if you have any disturbance on the call. If you either just pipe up or make a note in the chat, then that would be really helpful, and we can try and either speak a bit clearer or louder or closer to the phone, and hopefully you'll be able to hear everything we're saying. We do have quite detailed slides as well as we go through, so that if there is any disturbance, you're still able to hear what we're saying. But also, to reduce any other disturbance online, I suggest everyone goes on mute unless you're piping in for a question or something. It really helps reduce that background noise, although I think it seems like most people are on mute because I can't hear anything at the moment. Just also, I know there's been a few developments over the weekend, but this no deal preparation is still very much relevant. You've probably seen the Prime Minister has sent a letter to the EU requesting a delay, but that does still need to be considered by the EU 27. There's also a vote expected this week on the deal, but in the meantime, it's very much business as usual in no deal preparations from government side, from our understanding. So looking at today's agenda, we've really got until 12:30 today, but we do appreciate that's quite a lot of time, and if you have other meetings and things to rush off to, we appreciate that it's a full morning. So we're suggesting that we have a formal close after about 2 hours presenting, or if we get through quicker, whenever we do. But if you do, so that if you do have other things you have to run off to or dial out, then don't feel like you need to stay in once the presentation is over. However, we will be available until 12:30 to field any questions after this time. Can't promise to answer them all today, but what we can do is take them away and do some research and find those answers where we can for you, or flag them in our Q&A document, which I'll mention, I'll come on to in a minute. During today's session, we'll be looking at no deal guidance on changes to medicines regulation, medical device regulation, nutrition legislation where it's relevant to food supplements, and also customs procedure changes. We'll also touch on some of the wider changes that are relevant to businesses, but our focus is really on what's specific for the healthcare consumer industry today. Quick background to the webinar. PAGB was awarded a government grant via its Business Readiness Fund to help businesses prepare for the possibility of the UK leaving the EU without a deal on the 31st of October. So this webinar forms part of this work alongside the development of a guidance summary, which you should all have received, but we'll also send around as follow-up to this call. And as I just mentioned previously, a Q&A document that we'll be publishing after this webinar. It will bring together some of the outstanding questions as well as areas of any clarity or further development and government guidance that has happened since this webinar and the one that we held on the 10th of October. As mentioned previously, there will be time for Q&A at the end, but if you do have questions as we go through, do chime in or log them in the chat function on the side, which you should all be able to access on your computers. We'll use these questions, as I said, to inform that Q&A document so that those unable to attend today, or if you do have to drop off the call at any point, we'll be able to share any answers and outstanding queries. So moving on to changes to medicines regulation. In sum, our headlines are: if the UK leaves the EU without a deal on the 31st of October, the UK will no longer be in the EU regulatory network, and the MHRA will take on the EU's current regulatory functions for medicines in the UK. To place a medicine on the EU market, the market authorisation holder and applicants must be established in the EU or the EEA, and the QPPV and pharmacovigilance system master file must be based in the EU or EEA as well. However, to place the medicine on the market in the UK, the market authorization holder and the QPPV can initially be in the UK or the EU, but then they must be established in the UK by the end of 2020. The UK will continue to accept batch testing of medicines carried out in the EU and recognise QP certification from the EU, but it is expected that the EU and EEA countries will not necessarily accept UK certified products. There's been no changes to that guidance as of yet. So the government recommends 6 actions that companies should take in preparation. If you haven't already, securing capacity for rerouting freight away from Dover and Folkestone after 31st of October. I'll touch on these different routes later on in the presentation. Stockpile a minimum of 6 weeks additional supply. This, as you'll probably be aware, is relevant to POM and P medicines only from government's advice. Prepare logistics and supply chains for the new customs and border requirements. Ensure continued supply to the NHS as part of your contingency plans. Make alternative air freight plans for short shelf life products. And finally, they recommend notifying the Department of Health and Social Care of your company's plans if you haven't already. So first of all, we'll talk a bit about the changes to market authorization. I'm conscious that most consumer healthcare products have national licenses already, but just for completeness, I'll run through the centralized or centrally authorized products changes as well. So all caps will be converted into UK market authorization automatically on exit day. There will be a short yet unspecified opt-out period. The process for converting the caps into national authorizations is effectively they'll be grandfathered into UK market authorization. Market authorization holders will then have 1 year to provide relevant data to support this grandfathering submission to the MHRA. And submissions should include the single ECTD initiating sequence representing current authorization and approved position, a completed electronic application form, a summary list of all historical regulatory activity from the grant date of the original cap until this data is submitted to the MHRA, notification of whether or not the product is on the UK market at the time the notification is given. If it's not, the market authorization holder must say whether the product has been on the UK market any time after exit day, and if so, the date it was withdrawn from the market. The summary of product characteristics, and finally the packaging, labels and leaflets as they're currently approved. For caps pending a decision on exit day and without a positive CHMP opinion, the MHRA's approach will depend on the stage that the application has reached. So if it's reached 181 days, the MHRA will complete the assessment addressing any of the outstanding issues. If it's reached 120 days, then either the application can be submitted to the MHRA in the same format that it was submitted to the EMA for the MHRA to complete the application concurrently, or it can follow the new targeted assessment route, which is expected that it will be completed within 67 days of application. We'll touch on these new routes shortly. If the application is still in its first phase, then it will require an independent assessment by the MHRA. For decentralized and mutual recognition procedures authorized products, those will be unaffected after EU exit, and only variations, any variations should be submitted using the existing procedures. So any renewal applications pending a decision on exit day will be assessed by the MHRA. For MRPs where the UK is a reference member state and national market authorization has already been granted in the UK before the start of the procedure. For an MRP where the UK is a concerned member state, a national market authorization is issued if a positive outcome is reached. and any new renewal applications post-exit day should be submitted to MHRA in line with current best practice and in the same time frame. So that's 9 months before expiry. Does anyone have any questions on changes to market authorisations before we move on? Great, we'll press on. For abridged licences, UK abridged licences referencing an EU reference product which have been granted or subject to pending applications prior to exit day will remain valid after exit day. However, any new abridged applications will need to be based on reference products that are authorised in the UK, which includes caps that have been converted to the UK market authorisation, or non-converted caps which were granted before exit day. On variations, any pending variations on European procedures on exit day will automatically become national variations and will be processed under relevant national procedure. Current procedure will continue to apply for pending and new variations to UK MAs in line with the Human Medicines Regulations 2012. Any extension application should be submitted in accordance with the procedures for new market authorisations. The UK will recognise any Article 5 recommendation published by the CMDH before exit day. Any specific request from a market authorisation holder concerning the classification of a variation which is still pending on exit day or submitted afterwards will again need to be resubmitted directly to the MHRA. I already mentioned earlier the new market authorisation assessment routes in the UK. So the MHRA will be offering 3 new procedures for applications containing new active substances and biosimilars, in addition to the current procedure. So firstly, a targeted assessment for products submitted to the EMA and in receipt of a positive CHMP opinion. These are expected to be completed within 67 days. The second option is a full accelerated review, and the time frame for that is 150 days. And then the third route is a rolling review for staged applications throughout the product development to help better manage development risk. In addition, MHRA has said it will be working with industry to reduce the current 200-day standard to 180 days. Are there any questions? Again, I'll pause every so often, but if there are any questions, do please type them in the chat or just pipe up. Great. So this is probably quite an important one, but to recap on legal presence requirements. A market authorisation holder should be established in the UK by the 31st of July 2021. Where a UK market authorisation holder is not in place on day 1 of leaving the EU, companies will need to put in place a UK contact person within 4 weeks of exit day, who will be accessible to the MHRA in respect of any matter relating to the market authorisation. A QPPV should be established in the UK on day 1, but again, there will be a temporary exemption that will allow the EU QPPV to take responsibility for UK market authorisation until a UK QPPV can be established. But again, the cut-off point for that will be the 31st of July 2021. The UK market authorisation holder has the legal obligation to maintain and make available upon request the UK PSMF, which must be located in or electronically accessible from the UK at the same site at which adverse reaction reports can be accessed. Looking a bit closer at the changes on pharmacovigilance, All pharmacovigilance data will need to be submitted directly to the MHRA. So that includes risk management plans, reports of suspected adverse drug reactions, periodic safety update reports, and post-authorization studies. The good vigilance practices modules will remain in force, although the government has said that they may be replaced in time with the UK's own guidance, but for the time being, they remain relevant. Moving on to batch testing and certification, we've already touched on this in summary, but just to emphasise, the UK will continue to recognise batch testing of medicines carried out in either the UK or the EEA, either the EU or the EEA, or third countries with which the EU has a mutual recognition agreement. So this means that a QP based in an EU or EEA country will still be able to certify, release and assure compliance with the market authorization and good manufacturing practice for medicines that are either manufactured in the EU or the EEA or in a third country but imported through an EU country to the UK. Any changes to this will be consulted on with industry, and the government has advised that there will be at least a 2-year notice period before implementation if any changes are taken forward. However, in order to continue to import EU and EEA certified medicines, companies must notify the MHRA of their intention to do so within 6 months of leaving the EU, so that a revised wholesaler dealer authorization can be issued to account for this. Holders of this amended authorization will be required to put in place an assurance system to ensure that any medicines that have been QP certified, overseen, and this system will be overseen by a new responsible person for import, and they need to be established within 2 years of leaving the EU. Looking a bit closer at the new role, the responsible person for import may delegate activities, but ultimately they do remain responsible for quality assurance. They must implement a system for confirming the QP certification has taken place when importing to the UK any of the following products from a listed country. So a UK licensed medicine for use in the UK, a UK licensed medicine as an introduced medicine for supply to another third country, an EEA licensed medicine supplied to fulfill special clinical needs, an EEA licensed medicine imported as an introduced medicine for supply to another third country, and an EEA licensed medicine for use as starting material for a parallel import. Wholesalers will have 2 years after leaving the EU to put in place this responsible person for imports on their authorization. But the above points that we've just mentioned on quality assurance will need to be verified from the day after exit day. Looking at changes to packaging and leaflets, industry will have until the end of 2021 to amend certain details on packaging and package leaflets for products already on the UK market. Notably, the UK administrative information, such as market authorization holder's name and address, the UK product license number, and up-to-date information on the manufacturing site. The MHRA will continue to allow proposals for packaging in English that includes information from other jurisdictions, so for example Ireland, as long as it complies with UK requirements. The UK is also implementing new safety feature requirements in line with the Falsified Medicines Directive, but it's anticipated that the UK stakeholders will no longer be able to comply with the requirement to verify and authenticate, and as such their legal obligations to do so would be removed from all actors in the UK supply chain. Moving on to parallel imports, medicinal products that hold a market authorization in another member state or are CAPs which are essentially similar to a product that has been granted a UK market authorization will still be able to be imported under a parallel import license, as long as evidence that this other product is essentially similar is submitted to the MHRA. The parallel import regime will remain limited to the EU and EEA countries, and the MHRA will be able to vary, suspend or revoke a parallel import license if the UK reference product is itself varied, suspended or revoked. From the 31st of July 2021, parallel import license holders will need to be established in the UK. Until then, companies need to put in place a UK-based contact person within 4 weeks of leaving the EU, who is accessible to the MHRA in respect of any matter relating to the parallel import license. Are there any questions at this stage? Cool. We will move on to rerouting supplies. To address concerns. Oh, yes, hello.
Sorry, I'm a bit late to ask a question. Going back to the point where, for example, the slide where you mentioned RPI.
Yep.
Yeah, all the products we bring it from the Europe to the UK, which will come onto the license. So the requirement is the list should be available on the license.
So what should be available on the license? Sorry.
All the products imported from EU to UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, they should be listed on the wholesale license. That's the requirement, right? So every time we get the approval of the new product, do we need to make an immediate submission to get the license updated to facilitate the import from EU to UK?
I think that's what the government is saying, but I'll double check and clarify on that for each product.
Yeah, I mean, from industry's point of view, it will be really helpful if we do the periodic submissions rather than doing a submission for each approval.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I'll check whether it's periodic or if it's at point. Great. Sorry, I'm just noting this down. Okay. Are there any more questions before I move on to rerouting supplies? We will pause again towards the end of this section as well.
Just one quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If I understand correctly, as long as we are a manufacturing authorization holder in the UK and we sell to the UK, then there will be no change in terms of licensing or anything.
Yes, for UKMAs, there effectively will be no change. It's the changes will be ones that are crossing borders or that are licensed in the EU, where they'll be converted, and you'll have to submit to MHRA any renewals and variations.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I completely understand. If we are to sell to the EU from a UK manufacturing site, then we would have to register that particular medicine within the EU, like the European Medicine Agency, right?
Yeah, or the national regulator within the country you're exporting to.
Okay, because we normally export across the EU, so multiple countries.
Yeah, okay.
So in that case, it would be EMA.
I'm not sure, so the UK guidance doesn't specify whether it's EMA or whether it's national licenses. We'll have a look to see if there's been any further information from the EU, but the last we heard is that it's up to each EU country itself.
Okay.
But I think EMA.
Okay, and one last question. That also, if I understand your previous slides, means that the manufacturing, the authorization holder would have to have a base or an office in the EU, one of the EU markets. It cannot
be. Again.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yes, that's correct. There's been no guidance from the EU saying that they would accept UK market authorization holder or batch tested products. So our understanding is that to place a medicine on the market in the EU, you will need to have established legal presence in an EU country.
I understand. Thank you so much.
No problem. Okay. So on rerouting supplies, to address concerns around delays at the Dover and Folkestone borders, the government is running 2 services to reroute supplies away from these ports. The Department of Health has procured an express freight delivery service for urgent and temperature-controlled products for both small batches within 24 hours and then a 2 to 4 day pallet delivery service. Contracts have now been awarded to 3 different companies to supply this service, and it's recommended that all suppliers of POM and P medicines register for this express freight service as an important element of their preparedness arrangements, so that products can be moved quickly and efficiently in the event of any unforeseen disruption. The second service is the Department for Transport-led procured capacity. So this is the additional routes for roll-on, roll-off freight capacity on which all medicines and medical products will be prioritised, including GSL medicines. Again, contracts have now been awarded for a 6-month provision of 4 ferry services, although the framework that's in place to reprocure contracts is in place for 4 years, so it's anticipated it will be much longer term than 6 months. So again, you'll need to register for both of these services online, regardless of whether you registered last time. We can share the link as follow-up to this webinar if you haven't already registered, but it was advised by government that those forms were completed by the 16th of October and that they should be completed by colleagues working on the supply chain. Again, just to stress, if you're unsure whether you'd need this capacity or not, it's advised to register anyway. It doesn't guarantee that, it doesn't mean that you've got a ticket. If you've just registered, you'll then have to purchase those tickets after the registration. Moving on to applying for authorization licenses. To qualify for a manufacturer license to make, assemble or import human medicines to the UK, you must show the MHRA that you comply with EU good manufacturing practice and pass regular inspections at your site. And equally, to qualify for a wholesaler license to sell or supply medicines to anyone other than the patient using the medicine itself, you must comply with good distribution practice and pass regular inspections on your site. So our final slide on medicines regulation is just to flag that if you are experiencing disruption to your supplies or feel there is the potential for disruption, which usual procedures that you put in place can't resolve, you can report it to the National Supply Disruption Response Centre. Contact details should be shared directly with suppliers before the UK leaves the EU. We've not seen these contact details yet, but we'll keep an eye out for them and make sure that goes around to members as well. Were there any further questions on changes to medicines regulation before we move on to medical device regulation? Okay, great. Let's press on. I'll hand over to Rebecca now so you can have a bit of a break from my voice.
Hello. So just as a bit of an overview to changes to medical device regulation, the key initial takeaway points that we took from this are the conformity assessment carried out by UK notified bodies will no longer be recognised by the EU. Any European presence of a UK notified body, which is designated by a European competent authority, will be in compliance with EU law, and certificates will be valid in the EU. For a limited time period, devices in conformity with the applicable EU directive will continue to be allowed onto the UK market. The UK government will give UK-based notified bodies an ongoing legal status, and this means they'll continue to recognise the validity of certificates issued prior to the day that the UK leaves the EU. And finally, a new role known as the UK responsible person will be created for manufacturers who are outside of the UK, but we'll go into a bit more detail on this in a few slides' time. So in terms of what companies may need to do prior to this, it's important to review supply chains and assess how a no-deal Brexit might impact any products, and then make some contingency plans accordingly. And also, it would be useful to read the Department of Health and Social Care's letter to suppliers of medical devices. So we'll start off with changes to the role of the MHRA. So EU directives on in vitro diagnostic devices, active implementable medical devices, and medical devices will continue to apply to the UK through the UK medical devices regulations. This means that key elements contained in the EU IVDR and MDR will be transposed to the UK if there is a no-deal Brexit. The UK will have a regulatory system put in place from the 1st of November 2019, so after we leave on the 31st without a deal, if that is the case. And this will mirror all key elements of the EU MDR and be in line with the 2020 transitional timeline for the MDR. So this means the transitional timeline will remain the same from the 26th of May 2022. The IVDR will fully apply in all EU member states and the UK, but for medical devices this will be from 2020. So in practice, the MHRA will continue to perform market surveillance as required under the new regulation, including, for example, periodic safety update reports. The government released a no-deal readiness report last week, and this confirmed that the government has chosen to continue recognising medical devices that are approved for the EU market and are CE marked. If this changes, the government is planning on giving 2 years' notice for any changes. So changes to the role of the manufacturer. It's anticipated that UK-based authorised representatives will no longer be recognised in the EU. So because of this, new UK legislation will come into play, which means that a UK responsible person will be established for manufacturers based outside of the UK. The UK MDR requirements will continue to apply for manufacturers who are seeking conformity with EU directives, although there is a new schedule which sets out how annexes to the directives should be read, and this is specific to a UK context for when the UK leaves the EU. So to go into a bit more detail about the UK responsible person, from the day that the UK leaves the EU, as I mentioned, if a manufacturer is based outside of the UK, then it must have in place this new UK responsible person, and this refers to either an individual, such as a sole trader, or a legal person. So this UK responsible person must be established in the UK and will need to act on behalf of the manufacturer established outside of the UK to carry out specific tasks in relation to the manufacturer's obligations, and this includes registering with the MHRA before a device is placed onto the UK market. So in practice, only a manufacturer or a UK responsible person can legally place a device onto the UK market, meaning that a single manufacturer may need to have several designated UK responsible persons in place. If you are a designated UK responsible person yourself of a non-UK manufacturer, then documentary evidence will be required, and this could be in the form of a headed letter or a signed contract, which states the company name and address for both the overseas manufacturer and the UK responsible person. There will be no labelling changes that will reflect, required to reflect this role. And finally, the UK responsible person will need to be in place within a company within a designated grace period, and this reflects the grace period for registering devices with the MHRA following no-deal Brexit. We'll go into a bit more detail in this in a couple of slides' time. Manufacturers that wish to place a medical device on the EU market will need to follow a set of rules. So they need to have in place a valid CE certificate, and where required, find and apply for transfer to the EU or EEA notified body accredited to assess the particular class of device. They will need to have established an authorised representative within an EU member state, register with the national competent authority, and this depends on requirements of the member state in which the authorised representative is established, ensure that all associated documentation is up to date, and make all necessarily labelling changes to the product. So, for example, reflecting any changes to notified body numbers and making sure that the authorised representative is mentioned on the label. Does anyone have any questions on changes to medical device regulations so far? Okay, so moving on to parallel imports. Parallel importing from the EU into the UK will no longer be possible following a no-deal Brexit. So instead, companies will need to register with the MHRA and have a UK responsible person within the grace period that I will talk about shortly. So for a time-limited period, the UK will continue to allow devices to be placed on the UK market which are in conformity with the applicable EU directive. The current labelling requirements will continue to apply, and this includes requiring products to have a CE mark and devices to be certified with a notified body as long as they have a valid CE certificate. UK-based notified bodies will no longer be recognised by the EU, and products certified them can no longer be placed onto the EU market. Notified bodies will also be given ongoing legal status, and the validity of certificates that they are issued prior to exit day will continue to be recognised in the UK. And finally, the UK will continue to accept labelling in English, which includes information from other jurisdictions, as long as it complies with all UK requirements. So finally, in terms of the timelines for registering a medical device onto the UK market, after exit day, all devices will need to be registered with the MHRA prior to being placed onto the UK market. Given this is an extension of existing registration requirements. Oh. Hello, did someone have a question? Nope. Okay. So this is an extension of existing registration requirements, and to ensure that continued access, there will be a grace period following exit day, and this will allow for compliance of with the new registration process. So for devices, Class 3 medical devices, Class 2B implantable medical devices, and active implantable medical devices, the grace period will be 4 months. For Class 2B non-implantable medical devices, Class 2A medical devices, and IVD List B, it will be 8 months. And for Class 1 medical devices, self-certified IVDs, and Class A, it will be 12 months. So initially, the MHRA will require most products to be registered at the level of Global Medical Device Nomenclature Code, which means that groups of similar products can come under a single registration. The exception is Class 3 devices, which must have an individual product information registered. Once the MDR fully applies from May 2020, the UK will need to mirror the new requirements within the legislation, which will mean that individual registration of all products is necessary. When a device manufacturer is not established in the UK, then these products will need to be registered with the MHRA by the UK responsible person, which we mentioned earlier. And the requirement for companies to have this person in place is in line with the registration grace period of the medical devices. So that concludes our section on the regulation of medical devices. Does anybody have any questions on anything that was covered in this section?
Cool. So moving on to changes to nutrition legislation, which is of relevance to food supplements. In sum, there are fewer changes than there were to medicines regulation and medical device regulation, as the regulation is already devolved. And the EU Withdrawal Act 2019 does transpose EU regulations and tertiary legislation into UK law from exit day, which has already passed through Parliament. The areas that we'll cover in this section then are nutrition and health claims, vitamins, minerals, and certain other substances, food supplements, and finally food labelling. First of all, though, the appropriate UK authorities that will apply for nutrition legislation will be devolved across the 4 nations. So that will be Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Ireland Assembly, and the Department of Health in England. There are, however, powers within the Nutrition Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019, which were passed, that allow the UK Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to make legislation for the whole of the UK where devolved administrations agree. A new UK Nutrition and Health Claims Register will be put in place, and this will replace the EU Community Register in the UK. All listed nutrition and health claims will be adopted into this new UK register that are currently on the EU Community Register on exit day. Current guidance for complying with this regulation will still apply, with the exception of any references to the EU, which will be applicable for UK appropriate authorities instead. Only nutrition and health claims that are listed on the UK register may be used in the UK after exit day. Any pending applications must be resubmitted to the relevant UK authorities, and evidence submitted should continue to follow guidance provided by the European Food Safety Authority. The Department of Health and Social Care and Public Health England have recruited an expert panel to sit on the UK Nutrition and Health Claims Committee, who will undertake the evaluation of scientific evidence that's submitted. Officials from all 4 nations will also provide risk assessments on any favourable opinion issued by the UK Nutrition and Health Claims Committee. Regarding any on-hold claims, the UK government and devolved administrations will launch a call for evidence, following which a policy decision will be made on the UK's approach to on-hold claims. Existing on-hold claims may continue to be used in accordance with current regulations until this decision is made. Are there any questions on nutrition and health claims? Cool. So on vitamins, minerals, and certain other substances, The list of substances which are prohibited, restricted, or under scrutiny under current regulations will be included in Section F of the Community Register of Vitamins, Minerals, and certain other substances. Any prohibitions or restrictions of use or any substance under scrutiny placed onto Annex 3 of the regulations are applicable to all foods, including food supplements. Amendments made at EU level since the publication of the register on the 26th of March earlier this year have not been reflected in the UK register. This includes Regulation 2019-649, which restricts the level of trans fat, other trans fat naturally occurring in fat of animal origin, which may be present in any food, again including food supplements. On food supplements, specifically, minor changes to the regulatory framework are being made to insert the list of vitamins and minerals used in the manufacture of food supplements contained in the EU directive into the Nutrition Amendment EU exit regulations as schedules. Again, current UK guidance for complying with this regulation, with exception to any references to the EU, remain relevant under UK law. So the two schedules within within the updated regulations. Schedule 1 lists vitamins and minerals which may be used in the manufacture of food supplements, and Schedule 2 lists the chemical forms of vitamin and mineral substances which again may be used in the manufacture of food supplements. Are there any questions before I move on to food labelling? Great, so food labelling. Requirements for food labelling will remain broadly unchanged. There's no specific legislative changes that have been implemented. However, the following areas relevant to food supplements will be subject to change. So for foods intended for the UK market, the name and address of the food business operator must be in the UK. And equally, for foods intended for the EU market, the name and address of the food business operator must be in the EU. Both the UK government and the EU agreed that labels may carry two addresses, so both the UK and the EU addresses. The UK government has also indicated that over-stickering is acceptable, but the EU has not yet stated whether they will accept over-stickering. Any food which has entered the EU before 11 p.m. UK time, so midnight in Brussels, on the 31st of October 2019, will be permitted to sell through. However, any food which has not yet cleared customs, so it's still in transit, will not be permitted to sell through. The EU emblem will not be permitted for use on any food produced in the UK after exit day unless the EU has authorised that use. And again, nor will food produced in the UK will be able to be labelled as being of EU origin, of course. Identification marks on products of animal origin will need to carry the letters UK now within the oval mark. The UK government has advised that there will be a 21-month transition period from exit day to ensure that any labelling changes can be made. Were there any questions on food supplements or nutritional legislation changes before we move on to customs changes? Cool. So, changes to customs procedures. The key points of note on changes to customs procedures for companies are a new temporary tariff system of goods being imported from the EU to the UK will be established in the event of a no-deal exit. Whilst most goods are expected to be tariff-free, particularly pharmaceutical goods, under the temporary scheme, companies are encouraged to check those. So there's a link in the guidance document that we shared, and I'll also flash it up on the screen a bit later, just to make sure you've got the link to be able to check that. There will also be a new customs declaration system that companies will need to use to log imports up to 21 days before they're expected to cross the border. Companies that regularly import goods from the EU will be able to apply for transitional simplified procedures, which will allow companies to defer paying duty until after the good has been imported, and also providing full customs declaration details until after the good again has been imported. Should the UK leave without a deal, the government advises companies to make sure your business has an economic operator registration and identification number that starts with GB. We've been told that this will be happening automatically, but do make sure. Companies are advised to decide who will make the import declarations, whether this is yourselves or if it's a hired customs agent. You can also apply to make imports easier by the transitional simplified procedures that I've mentioned. Again, that will help to set up duty deferment for those who import regularly. And finally, again, as mentioned, check the rate of tax and duty you'll need to pay under the temporary tariff arrangements. So going into a bit more detail on authorization changes for customs special procedures, there will be some changes depending on where the authorizations are issued. So authorizations issued in the UK will still be valid for importing goods from the EU alongside goods from non-EU countries. However, you should write to the HMRC authorization team if there are any changes to the range of commodity codes, quantities or values of products that you'll be importing. Single authorizations issued in the UK for use in the EU will only be valid in the UK for importing goods. Again, you should write to HMRC if there are any changes to the goods that you'll be importing through this route. And authorizations given by another EU customs authority will not be valid in the UK. Companies will have 1 year to discharge those goods from any customs special procedure. A new UK status will be brought in to replace existing EU status for economic operator authorizations for the UK. So UK established businesses, including a new certificate and logo for use. It's expected that only economic operator status authorizations issued in the UK will not be valid in the EU. And the UK equally will not recognise economic operator status issued by another EU customs authority, so that they will not be able to access the same benefits of the status in the UK. Again, touching on those temporary rates of customs duty in a little bit more detail that we have. So this new temporary regime will be implemented on day one and will be in place for up to 12 months. Again, most of the imports should be tariff-free. However, do check what rates might apply to your different products that you're importing. So this is the link here. Do make a note of it if you haven't already. And it's also included on the guidance document that we've shared and will reshare as follow-up to this webinar. Should the UK leave the EU without a deal, a new customs process will be put in place from exit day for bringing goods into the UK through roll-on, roll-off ports and the Channel Tunnel. Custom declarations will not be made at the border. Companies will have to declare goods before checking them onto the ferry or train on the EU side, and this needs to be made up to 21 days before they're due to arrive at the departure port. The transitional simplified procedure will be available, which will allow companies to delay making that full detailed declaration and paying any duty until after. Once goods have arrived in the UK, the declaration will need to be updated to confirm that they've arrived, and usually this will be no later than the end of the working day after the goods arrival. For simplified declarations, you will have to submit supplementary declaration by the 4th working day of the month after they've arrived in the UK. However, we've been advised that HMRC will be prompting importers on that, so that you'll know when to update your declarations. And finally, on customs changes, just looking at VAT. If your business is registered for VAT in the UK, you will be able to account for import VAT on your VAT return instead of when they arrive at the border. If you're not VAT registered in the UK, though, you will need to pay import VAT at the time the goods are imported. Goods already in transit from the EU will continue to be treated as acquisitions and account for VAT on the return for the period in which the acquisition takes place. Goods brought into the UK under customs freight simplified procedures with the simplified declaration completed before EU exit will not be eligible for counting VAT on VAT return. You'll be able to check if a UK VAT number is valid through a UK VAT checking service. We've not seen the link to this yet, but again, this should be being shared with companies directly, and we'll share it once we've had sight of it. You won't be able to use the EU's VAT number validation service or the EU VAT refund electronic system after EU exit. The final point just to make on customs procedures is that the government has said it will establish a dedicated trader readiness unit to support the health and social care sector specifically. This new unit will provide practical guidance and advice for companies on steps to take to make sure you're ready for new customs arrangement. This may have been communicated directly to you, it should have been, but the email address for that, should you need to ask any detailed questions or get some government advice, is betraderready, all one word, at dhsc.gov.uk. So that's betraderready at dhsc.gov.uk. Are there any questions on changes to customs procedures? Okay, we'll move on now to the final section of wider changes that are relevant to businesses.
So firstly, with regards to intellectual property, UK companies will still be participating in the European Patent Convention, and this can be applied for to the European Patent Office for patent protection, which will continue to cover in the UK. Relevant EU legislation will be retained in UK law, and this includes changes to supplementary protection certificate system, which was introduced in April 2019. It covers IP protection for medicines. So these current systems will be operating independently from the EU regime. So any existing rights and licenses in force in the UK will remain automatically, so no action is required from the rights or license holder. Businesses can also continue to obtain a compulsory license for manufacturing a patented medicine for health needs in developing countries. So with regards to trademark rights, the government will ensure that the property rights in all existing registered EU trademarks and registered community designs will continue to be protected and be enforceable in the UK. And they will do this by providing an equivalent trademark or design which will be registered in the UK. So rights holders with an existing EU trademark or registered community design will have a new UK equivalent right granted that will come into force at the point of the UK's exit from the EU, and this should be provided with minimal administrative burden. The trademark or design will then be treated as if it's been applied for and registered under UK law. This means that trademarks and designs will be subject to renewal in the UK, and they will also form the basis for proceedings before the UK courts, and the Intellectual Property Office tribunals can be assigned and licensed independently from the UK rights. So with regards to Horizon 2020 funding, the government has committed to guarantee funding for all successful competitive UK bids to Horizon 2020 that are submitted before the UK leaves the EU if there is a no-deal Brexit. So the guarantee covers all successful competitive UK bids which are open to third country participation if they're submitted between Brexit and the end of 2020. So both the guarantee and extension commit funding to the UK Horizon 2020 participants for the lifetime of the projects. The UK Research and Innovation will also manage the independent assessment of UK applications to the European Research Council, the MSCA and SMI grants, which have been submitted before Brexit if they are not assessed by the European Commission. And again, successful applications will be funded for the lifetime of those projects. And finally, it's also important to note that the current UK recipients of Horizon 2020 funding will need to provide initial information about their projects on the UKRI portal. In terms of employment, there will be no change to the right of work of EU, EEA and Swiss citizens and their family members living in the UK until the 31st of December 2020 if the UK leaves the EU without a deal. So employers will need to check a job applicant's right to work in the same way as now up until the 1st of January 2021. EU, EEA or Swiss citizens and their family members who are living in the UK before the UK leaves the EU can apply to the EU settlement scheme to continue living in the UK after the 31st of December 2020. If EU, EEA and Swiss citizens arrive in the UK after the UK leaves the EU, but before the 1st of January 2021, then they can apply for European temporary leave to remain. And the deadline for applications to this is the 31st of December 2020. So following these dates, a new points-based system will be introduced for immigration, which will come into play from 2021, whether we leave the EU with or without a deal. So further details on this scheme are currently being considered by the Migration Advisory Committee, so further updates should come in due course. Does anyone have any questions so far about wider changes to businesses? Okay, moving on to personal data. So there won't be any immediate changes to the UK's data protection standards, and the GDPR will still apply under the Information Commissioner's independent supervisory authority. UK businesses that receive personal data from the EU or the EEA will need to review their contracts to ensure that they include standard contractual clauses or other alternative transfer mechanisms which will allow them to continue legally receiving this data. If there is no Brexit deal, then you'll no longer be able to register or renew .eu domain names. If your organisation, business or undertaking is established in the UK but not in the EU or EEA, or if you live outside of the EU and EEA and are not an EU EEA citizen. Moving on to structuring cross-border businesses. UK registered companies which operate in the EU should check that they meet relevant EU countries' incorporation requirements, which means they may need to make some adjustments to their structure. UK companies within the European Economic Area with corporate appointments and EEA companies registered with Companies House will need to provide some additional information to Companies House within 3 months of exit day. If the EU cross-border merger regime is being used by a UK company currently, then they will need to be in an advanced stage of this process if they are able to complete the mergers before Brexit, since this is a requirement for the mergers to go through. So companies may wish to seek some professional advice on this if they are in this process but not yet in the advanced stages. So finally, the last point to make is regarding public sector procurement. So if the UK leaves the EU without a deal, then the public procurement regulations will remain broadly unchanged. So in March of this year, the Minister for the Cabinet Office made a statutory instrument which will amend the procurement regulations to ensure that they continue to operate effectively after exit day, as the statutory instrument will be coming into force on the day that the UK leaves the EU. For the most part, the legal framework for public procurement, and in particular the different procedures available to contracting authorities and entities, will remain exactly the same. One key difference for contracting authorities will be the need to send notices to the new UK e-notification service instead of the EU Publications Office. So this new service is called Find a Tender and will be deployed from 11 PM on the 31st of October in the event that the UK leaves the EU without a deal. So suppliers wishing to access new contract opportunities in the UK from the UK public sector will need to access the new UK e-notification service instead of OJEU, and access details will be provided in further updates. For procurements that have commenced before the UK leaves the EU, contracting authorities will need to comply with the new regulations from that point, for example, by posting subsequent contract award notices on the new e-notification service. However, the effect of the former rules will be preserved in some circumstances to maintain fairness throughout the procurement. And a final point, contracting authorities which commence their procurement after the UK leaves the EU will need to follow the amended regulations. So does anybody have any questions on the section we just covered? Just to remind you, the chat function is also available if that is an easier way to ask us a question.
Cool. So that completes the presentation aspect of this webinar. So we'll formally close the webinar and end the recording. However, we will stay on the line to answer any questions where we can, logging those that we can't answer today to follow up with in the Q&A document. It's also a good opportunity now for any companies to share experiences of putting in place any of the steps to prepare for no deal, for example, any particular challenges or advice that you'd like to share with other companies or with PAGB, and that won't be included in the recording either. So we're probably just going to fill around with screens now to end the recording. And whilst we're doing that, just a reminder for